It was on a rainy Sunday morning in Northern Ireland that I spotted Larry from across a crowded church. Now, the pews in this church were laid out in an unusual fashion. They were square booths with benches inside so that 6 or 8 people could sit facing one another. You opened the door to climb into your booth, and then you closed it behind you. So Larry was seated in one of these pews, leaning forward eagerly so as not to miss anything. I want to tell you about Larry. I met Larry before I met Larry. What I mean is, I saw a documentary about him before I actually met him. Larry lives at the L'Arche community in Belfast. He is small in stature. His words and phrases are simple. He has rumpled hair and glasses that are slightly askew, and a smile that can light up any room. Now, the story told in this documentary is about when Larry's community had a Guess Whose Baby photo contest. Everyone brought in a baby photo. Everyone but Larry. Larry grew up in an institution, and he didn't have any baby photos. And so started his quest. It began with Siri. Larry, baby photos? To which Siri would respond, I'm not sure I understand. He'd try again. Larry, baby photos, please. Siri, there's no need for that. But with the help of assistants in his home, Larry began to search online, looking on the internet for a photo of himself as a baby, day in and day out, for months and months, with no results. But after the unexpected death of a relative, Larry received a condolence card from a cousin in Canada that he'd never met. Larry wrote back to his cousin, and in the end, you guessed it, this faraway relative sent him his long-lost baby photo. And I'm told that from then on, he always carried it with him. So back to church that Sunday morning in Northern Ireland with Larry seated in his box pew, taking everything in, responding to the sermon, delighting in the music, and leaning over the pew with something clutched in his hand. As the offertory collection was being taken up all around the church, the sides person somehow skipped over Larry's booth. And as the hymn went on, from where I could see him in the church, I saw him waiting and waiting, leaning further and further over the pew in his effort to flag down the usher. But the hymn drew to a close, and the plates were piled together and lifted toward the altar. And then Larry just couldn't contain himself. He reached over the edge of his booth and opened the latch, and he bounded down the aisle. And he reached up over the raised plate and tipped his offering just over the edge. And then beaming, he sprinted back to his seat and closed the door and fastened the latch. I'd never seen someone so excited to give their offering. In today's gospel, we spot Jesus in the crowded temple in Jerusalem. Now, on an ordinary day, this place would have been humming with the sounds of building, buying, and selling, and slaughtering. Even more so in the days leading up to Passover, when the city would have been teeming with hundreds of thousands of pilgrims coming to observe the feast. Now, for centuries, the Temple Mount had been the site of conquest, destruction, and reconstruction. The first temple, Solomon's temple, dating back to about the 10th century BCE, it was the center of national life, the seat of the monarchy, and its storerooms held the temple treasury. This temple was dashed to the ground by the Babylonians. Loot was carried off, and the wooden inner structures burnt to the ground. But the stone foundation and some of the external structures remained. And so the second temple, restored after the exile, that too was brought down by the Greeks. And then the third temple. The third temple was Herod's extravagant building project, his pitch to win the affection of his Jewish subjects and to impress the authorities back in Rome. This temple was the temple in Jesus' time. Now, within the temple grounds, there were layers of access. The general public could only go as far as the temple courts, where the burnt sacrifices were offered. Only priests could enter further into the nave or into the holy place, where the bread of presence was kept and incense was burnt. And only the chief priest could enter the innermost sanctuary, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, just once a year on the Day of Atonement. This place was called the Holy of Holies, and it was believed to be God's dwelling place on earth. It meant that God had a place to stay and that the people had a means of accessing God. So when Jesus enters the outer court of the temple, he finds vendors selling animals to be offered for sacrifice, cattle and sheep to those who could afford to buy them, pigeons or doves to those of lesser means. He finds money changers ready to exchange Roman coins into temple coins so that the temple tax could be paid. We can only imagine what Jesus may have felt when he saw such a beautiful and sacred place used as a toll booth to collect exorbitant fees from people who couldn't really afford them. Was it anger that filled him as he watched a privileged few, the inner circle, making profits and brokering sacrifices? Was it sadness at the sight of all those ordinary people outside the walls, their access blocked? How many earnest and sincere people clutching their offering in their hand, eager to give, wholehearted in their desire, but blocked from all the action? I imagine it was this sight, all those Larrys, that provided Jesus with the moment of fierce clarity that moved him to chase the animal sellers out of the temple, to overturn the tables of the money changers, and to command them, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." Now, Jesus wasn't protesting Judaism or its sacred practices here. In fact, he was continuing in a long line of Hebrew prophets who protested against empty or false sacrifice. Jeremiah, Amos, Hosea, to name a few. We recall the words of the prophet Micah. "With what shall I come before the Lord? With burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oils? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression? He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." Like the prophets before him, Jesus deployed creative speech and symbolic action to get people to think outside the box. When pressed for a sign of his authority, Jesus responds, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Incredulous, they reply, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But as John tells us in an aside, Jesus was speaking of this temple, the temple of his body. I think Jesus was trying to stretch their imaginations beyond the rigid categories of class or ethnicity or gender that would favor the few over the many. This scene in the temple, which takes place in chapter 2 of John's Gospel, it sets the stage for a series of boundary-breaking encounters for Jesus. He accepts a drink of water from the Samaritan woman at the well. He heals a paralyzed man on the Sabbath. He defends a woman about to be stoned for adultery. He restores sight to a man born blind. He raises Lazarus from the dead. And in each one of these meetings, Jesus himself embodies the truth of God's limitless love, a love that is outside any box that we would put it in. Remember the opening verses of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. Jesus was speaking of the temple of his body. And while this may have seemed nonsensical to his followers in that moment, it takes on another layer of meaning if we consider that John's Gospel was written after the destruction of Herod's temple in 70 AD. So we might hear this as a prophetic word, a word of consolation to Jesus' Jewish followers who have lost their sacred meeting place with God. Jesus is God's temple, and so are we. This is the mystery of the incarnation, that in Jesus and in each one of us, God comes to meet us where we are, not in some walled-off place that we have to earn or buy our way into, but here in this temple, in these temples, these strange bodies that will serve us, and in the end, that will fail us. As Paul writes in his first letter to the Corinthians, do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? This is our work as people learning to follow Jesus, to live into the outrageous reality that God is already inside us from the time we're babies, residing in our heart of hearts and forming us and shaping us into people whose outer lives are filled with compassionate word and action. This is the wholeness that God desires for us, an inner life where we can receive God's love with all our heart, with all our mind, with all our soul and all our strength, and an outer life where we act justly, love kindly, and walk humbly with God. It's not always easy to hold these inner and outer realities together. It helps to have people like Larry to show us the way. Tireless seekers, exuberant givers, and outside-the-box thinkers. And it helps to come to church, to be encouraged, to sing, to pray, to give, and to receive, so that our vision can be sharpened, our horizons expanded, and our souls deepened. We don't come to church because it's the only place we can meet God. We come to church because, by God's grace, it's a place where we can be reminded again and again that we can always meet God, anywhere and everywhere. Amen.